More Americans are choosing to retire overseas than ever before. And these are the things many never expected after leaving home. According to recent surveys, about 44% of Americans have seriously considered retiring in another country, yet fewer than 1% actually make the move. Meanwhile, millions are looking toward Mexico, Thailand, and Portugal as a way to make their retirement years more affordable. What's remarkable isn't that more people want to leave. What's remarkable is that more people feel they can no longer afford to grow old in the country where they spent their lives. And the thing that surprises many of them most isn't where they move, it's what they lose along the way. Because years later, many discover a strange truth. The place they once called home is still there on the map. But the life that once belonged to them, there is not. For a very long time, most Americans believed they knew exactly how their lives would unfold. They would work hard, pay off the mortgage, save for the future, and eventually reach old age with a reasonable sense of security. Not wealthy, not luxurious, just free from worrying every time a bill showed up in the mailbox. It wasn't just a financial plan. It was a promise that an entire generation believed in. The problem is that promise is starting to crack. Today, more and more people are realizing that the old formula doesn't work the way it used to. Instead of working, paying off the house, and retiring, they're stepping into a very different reality. They work. They save. They do everything they can to prepare for retirement. And they still worry. This change didn't happen overnight. It arrived slowly. So slowly that many people only notice it when they look back a few years and wonder why money that once felt sufficient no longer goes as far as it used to. The average retired household in the United States now spends around $5,000 a month. Meanwhile, the average Social Security benefit is only about $2,000 a month. That gap doesn't exist only on an economic chart. It shows up in everyday life. It shows up when someone decides to postpone a dental appointment for a few more months to save money. It shows up when a familiar prescription is replaced with a cheaper alternative. It shows up when a couple starts paying much closer attention to prices at the grocery store, even though they never had to do that before. And eventually, it starts showing up in places that are impossible to miss. Walk into almost any Walmart. Look around the checkout lanes or the pickup area. More and more of the people working there are people who, years ago, expected to be retired by now. Not because they love working retail, not because they're looking for a way to stay busy. For many, it's simply a way to close the gap between what they have and what life now demands. Some pick up a few extra shifts each week. Some deliver food on weekends. Some return to the workforce after believing they would never have to do that again. What's remarkable is how invisible this crisis has become. There are no long lines of protesters in the streets, no urgent headlines leading the evening news every night. Instead, it's made up of millions of small decisions happening behind closed doors. Each decision on its own seems insignificant. But when millions of people start making the same decisions, they begin to tell a much bigger story. A delivery driver bringing food to someone's front door at an age when they expected to be retired. A story about people who did almost everything they were told to do. They worked, they saved, they planned. Yet they still feel retirement drifting farther away from what they once imagined. And that's when a question begins to enter more and more minds. If growing old at home is becoming harder, is there somewhere else in the world where retirement might be a little easier? Today, many people aren't truly retiring. They're simply changing the way they work. As more Americans begin to question the retirement plan they trusted for decades, something interesting starts to happen. They don't just look toward the future. They start looking beyond the border. At first, It's just the occasional story that appears on a phone screen. A retired couple living in Mexico. A former teacher who moved to Portugal. Someone who spent a career in healthcare and relocated to Thailand. The stories seem different on the surface, yet they share something in common. None of these people talk about becoming wealthier. They talk about life becoming easier. In Mexico, many find something they feel they lost years ago. The sense that their money still has value, not because they're living lavishly, but because, for the first time in years, they no longer have to overthink ordinary decisions. Going out for dinner, taking a weekend walk, meeting friends. Simple things no longer come with the familiar feeling of financial anxiety. Thailand attracts Americans in a different way. Many describe the relief of no longer treating healthcare as a constant source of stress. There are modern private hospitals where costs can be only a fraction of what they would be in the United States. But what surprises many people isn't the bill itself. It's the feeling of no longer having to choose between their health and their finances every time they need to see a doctor. In Portugal, the appeal often comes from something else entirely: the pace of life. After years of living in a culture that constantly pushes people to be faster, more productive, and busier, many are surprised to discover that life doesn't have to feel like a never-ending race. The mornings seem longer. The conversations last a little more. The days move at a slower pace. Vietnam offers a completely different feeling. Quite a few Americans arrive planning to stay for a few months before moving on. Then they stay. Not because of the numbers on a retirement budget spreadsheet, but because life feels alive. The crowded streets, the cafes filled with conversation, and the energy of a society that is still growing create a sharp contrast to the sense of stagnation many say they felt back home. And then there's Japan. Perhaps the most interesting option of all. Japan isn't cheap. In fact, many parts of the country are more expensive than other popular retirement destinations. But what attracts people there has very little to do with cost. It's the feeling that things still work the way they're supposed to. The trains arrive on time. The streets are clean. Services operate reliably. Those things may sound ordinary. Yet together, they create a sense of stability that many people don't realize they've been missing. The most appealing thing about these places isn't better beaches, cheaper food, or larger apartments. It's the feeling of being able to breathe. After years of constantly worrying about the future, many begin to feel that life is no longer a battle they have to win every single day. For the first time in years, life no longer feels like a constant struggle. And that's when the dream begins. What draws more and more Americans toward the idea of retiring overseas isn't travel advertising or economic reports. It's the people who have actually done it. On YouTube, Facebook, and retirement forums, stories like these are becoming more common every year. Linda, a retired high school teacher, moved to Portugal after spending more than 30 years in the classroom. Karen, a retired nurse from Arizona, started a new chapter of her life in Thailand. Tom and Susan sold the house they had lived in for nearly 20 years and relocated to Mexico. What's interesting is that they don't come across as people who gave something up. They come across as people who found something they had been missing. Linda often shares videos of quiet mornings at a small cafe near her home. Karen posts photos of weekend trips and meals that she rarely felt comfortable treating herself to in the past. Tom and Susan film sunset, walks along the beach, with smiles that many viewers say they never saw in the couple's older videos back when they lived in the United States. Videos like these attract hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of views. And what makes them so compelling isn't the scenery, it's the feeling. The people in these videos aren't millionaires. They aren't celebrities. They're ordinary people dealing with ordinary problems. They worried about money. They worried about getting older. They wondered whether their savings would really be enough for the rest of their lives. Then one day, they decided to try a different path. And that's what causes millions of other people to start asking a very simple question. If Linda could do it, if Karen could do it, if Tom and Susan could do it, why can't I? Little by little, retiring overseas stops feeling like a distant dream. It starts feeling like something that might actually be possible. A door opening for people who feel their future in the United States is becoming harder to afford. And just when everything begins to look perfect, many people discover they've only seen half the story. The other half rarely appears in those videos. If life overseas were truly as perfect as it often looks on a screen, an interesting question starts to emerge. Why have roughly 44% of Americans seriously considered retiring abroad, yet fewer than 1% actually do it? The answer turns out not to be about money, because during the first few years, things often unfold exactly as expected. Life slows down. The pressure eases. Financial worries no longer show up every day the way they once did. For many people, it becomes the most enjoyable period they've experienced in decades. But then something begins to change. Not in the first year. Usually, not even in the second. It happens in the 5th year, or the 10th. When the new life is no longer an adventure, it's simply life. And that's when different questions begin to appear. A grandchild's birthday that you can only watch through a phone screen. A family gathering taking place while it's already past midnight outside your window. A call from back home telling you that the neighbor who lived next door for 20 years has passed away. None of those moments seem especially significant on their own. But those moments add up over time, month after month, year after year, until a very strange feeling begins to emerge. You realize you no longer fully belong to the place you left behind, but you never completely belong to the place where you live now, either. The hardest part isn't building a new life. The hardest part is watching your old life continue without you. That's the part that rarely appears in videos about retiring overseas. Because tropical beaches, beautiful apartments, and dinners by the water are much easier stories to tell. But for many people, this is where the real challenge begins. As the excitement of the move slowly fades, they start to realize that they didn't just relocate to a new country. They gradually moved away from a network of relationships that took decades to build. And that process doesn't happen all at once. You don't leave America in a single day. You leave it a little at a time. For many people who retire overseas, the hardest moment doesn't come on the day they leave the United States. It comes years later. During the first few years, home still feels close. You still call your friends. You still follow local news. You still believe that if you ever decide to return, everything will be just the way you left it. But time doesn't stop moving just because you moved away. While you're building a new life in another country, your old life keeps moving forward without you. One friend passes away. Then another. The neighbor who lived next door for 20 years moves somewhere else. New families move in. The kids who used to ride their bikes down that street grow up and start families of their own. And then there are your grandchildren. Each passing year brings more moments that can never be repeated. A school performance, a weekend ball game, a graduation ceremony, a birthday party. After 10 years abroad, many people realize they've missed dozens of family milestones that will never happen a second time. The strange thing is that you usually don't realize it while it's happening. You only realize it when you look back. Perhaps the most painful moment comes when you return to visit the place you once called home. The street is still there. The house is still there. The church is still there. The grocery store is still there. Everything looks familiar. But then you realize something else. You still remember the names of the people who used to live on that street. But no one on that street remembers your name anymore. That's when many people begin to understand that they didn't just miss a few events. They missed an entire chapter of life. The place still exists on the map, but it no longer exists the way they remember it. Home is still there, but the life that once belonged to them is not. The most painful part isn't leaving home. The most painful part is discovering there's no longer a home to return to. After hearing stories about homesickness, many people offer a very simple response. You'll get used to it. And sometimes that's true. Human beings have an incredible ability to adapt. But the problem is that what many people lose isn't just an address. It's an entire invisible support system that took decades to build. When you're living back home, you rarely think about that system. You simply use it every day. You know who to call when something goes wrong with the house. You know which clinic can fit you in on short notice. You know which pharmacy stays open late. You know which neighbor has a spare key. Those things sound small, until they're gone. Imagine it's 2 o'clock in the morning. You wake up with severe pain or an unexpected health problem. Back home, you barely have to think about what to do next. You know who to call. You know which hospital to go to. You know which pharmacy stays open all night. You know who can help if something goes wrong. But in a new country, even the simplest questions can sometimes become much harder to answer. And that's when many people begin to realize the true value of things they once took for granted. One of the biggest shocks for many retirees living abroad doesn't come from cultural differences or language barriers. It comes from ordinary, everyday situations. You need to see a doctor, but you're not sure where to start. Something in your home needs to be repaired, but you don't know who to call. An unexpected problem comes up. But the familiar network that once helped you solve those problems with a single phone call is no longer there. At age 30 or 40, those challenges may be little more than an inconvenience. At 70, they can become a very real source of stress. That's why many people say the hardest part of retiring overseas isn't learning how to live in a new country. It's learning how to rebuild your entire support system from scratch. Someone can find a new apartment in a matter of weeks. They can buy a new car in a matter of days. But the sense of security built over 3 or 4 decades is much harder to replace. And that's the part most people never see in videos about retirement by the beach. They see the apartment. They see the restaurants. They see the scenery. What they don't see are the decades of relationships, routines, and trust quietly supporting everyday life. People don't really live in a country. They live inside a network of familiar connections. And sometimes the hardest thing to replace isn't the house you left behind. It's the entire system that made that house feel like home in the first place. By this point, many people believe they've already made it through the hardest part. They've sold the house, moved their belongings, adjusted to a new life, and finally built a routine that feels happier than the one they left behind. But then another reality begins to emerge. Leaving a country is often much easier than leaving behind the system that shaped your life for 3 or 4 decades. One retiree once said the most surprising moment wasn't the day he moved overseas. It was the day he realized he was still spending time dealing with issues tied to the system he thought he had left behind. That was when he understood something important. He had changed his address, but he hadn't completely escaped everything connected to that address. This is the part that rarely appears in videos about retiring abroad, not because it isn't important, but because it isn't as appealing as tropical beaches or ocean view apartments. Nobody makes a 10-minute video about banking paperwork. Nobody films themselves spending hours dealing with administrative tasks. Yet those things are a very real part of everyday life. Many people move overseas believing they're starting over. Then they discover that the ties connecting them to their old system are still there. Every year, there are responsibilities that still need attention, rules that still need to be understood, paperwork that still needs to be handled. The shock isn't the regulations themselves. The shock is the feeling. The feeling that you've traveled a very long way, yet part of your old life is still traveling with you. And then there's healthcare. Many people spend decades paying into programs designed to support them later in life and assume they understand how the system works. But after living long-term in another country, they begin to realize that things are far more complicated than they once imagined. That's when a new question starts to appear. If health becomes the top priority someday, which system will I depend on? The old one or the new one? It's the kind of question that never appears in a travel brochure. It doesn't show up in videos titled "Retire in Paradise on $2,000 a month" either. But over time, it becomes part of reality. Perhaps the biggest surprise is that many people believe they're buying freedom. Then they discover they've really traded one familiar system for another that feels far less familiar. And that's when they come to understand something important. You can leave a country, but it's much harder to leave behind the system you've lived with for 40 years. After all the stories about Mexico, Thailand, Portugal, and Vietnam, one question still remains. If life overseas can be so appealing, why have roughly 44% of Americans considered retiring abroad, while fewer than 1% actually do it? Many people assume the answer is money, but the reality is often much deeper than that. For most people, the decision to stay is rarely made on a spreadsheet. It's made in the ordinary moments of everyday life. An evening spent watching the grandkids, a grandson's weekend ball game, a phone call from a daughter asking for help, a family dinner on Thanksgiving. None of those things appear in a cost of living calculation. Yet they often carry far more value, especially as people grow older. Because at some point, many begin to realize that what they need most isn't a cheaper apartment or a better beach. What they need is the comfort of knowing that the people they love are nearby when something happens. Imagine it's 3 o'clock in the morning. You're facing an emergency, or a family member suddenly needs help. A distance of thousands of miles is no longer just a number on a map. It becomes something very real. And that's when many people understand that retirement isn't just a decision about where they want to live. It's also a decision about where they want to grow old. There's an interesting truth about human psychology. We can tolerate familiar difficulties far longer than unfamiliar risks. A system may frustrate us. A city may become more expensive every year. Life may no longer look the way it once did. But at least we understand how it works. We know who to call. We know where to go. We know what happens next. A new life in another country, on the other hand, always comes with unknowns. And as people move into the later chapters of life, many realize that peace of mind can sometimes be worth more than adventure. That's why most people ultimately stay, not because they never dreamed of a different life, but because they understand that some things can't be measured in dollars. Familiarity is a form of insurance that no company can sell. For most of modern history, Americans grew up with a very simple promise: work hard, save your money, build a family, and one day grow old in the same place where you spent a lifetime building your life. It wasn't a luxury dream. It was something that once felt completely ordinary. Today, more and more people are beginning to wonder whether that ordinary future is still within reach, caught between the desire for a life with a little more breathing room and the desire to hold on to what took decades to build. This is not a story about people leaving the United States. It's a story about people who are no longer certain they can grow old in America the way they once expected to. More Americans are choosing to retire overseas than ever before. And these are the things many never expected after leaving home. What's remarkable is that more and more people feel they can no longer afford to grow old in the country where they spent their lives. For many, Mexico, Thailand, and Portugal are starting to look like a second chance, a place where their money goes further, a place where retirement seems a little easier. But then, many discover that moving to a new country only takes a few hours on a plane. What's much harder is understanding exactly what gets left behind. And that's the part of the story that rarely appears in the beautiful photos people share online.